vertically integrated, CSR into business development efforts and created partnerships with government entities, associations and NGOs that have increased access to legal services for thousands across the country. As a managing director of the Individuals and Communities at Risk program at Amnesty International USA, he oversaw a crisis response unit that responded to 500 human rights incidents each year. Previously, Samir co-founded his own nonprofit organization in Illinois, where he organized survivors and led coalitions that transformed states' response to human trafficking. His opinion pieces have been published in The Guardian, the San Francisco Chronicle, CNN.com, World Affairs Journal, and other outlets. I may need your help for that. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including 40 who have made a difference by business and professional people for the public interest, and the Impact Award by Chicago Foundation for Women. Welcome, Samir Goswami.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to start by apologizing. Had I known it was going to be read out, I would have given you a much shorter bio. Well, thanks again for coming. As also mentioned, I'm also a PTL here at Rutgers. I live in Washington, D.C. and it's been a lot of fun to teach a course online for the last couple semesters. I very much appreciate how diverse my classes have been from various different backgrounds as well. So it's just been an absolute pleasure. So I look forward to this. Before we start out, who all brought their phone? Can you pull your phone out? If you got it, you can do yours. Just pull it out. I want you to Google, each one of you, whoever's got your phone. Google list of goods made by forced and child labor.
List of?
List of goods made by forced and child labor. So it should be a Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Labor website. What does it say? What is that list?
It's quite a list.
Quite a list of what?
First of all, agricultural goods, sugarcane, cotton, coffee, tobacco, cattle, rice. Manufacturing sector, beads, garments, textiles, footwear, carpets. I'm sure that many of us actually maybe as we speak wear some items of
including your phone.
Yeah.
So that is a U.S. government publication that comes out every single year. It just came out this year a few weeks ago, where the U.S. Department of Labor lists out which goods around the country, or around the world, could be made by child labor or forced labor. So it's about 148 goods in 76 countries. A lot of those goods are being imported into the U.S. So we estimate that's what $400 billion worth of goods are being imported into the U.S. that could be made by forced and child labor. And I want you to think about that for a second, and think about the stuff that's on that list and the items that you may buy every single day or every week that are on that list. In 2018, 150 plus years after the abolition of slavery here, we have goods that are made by child labor and forced labor that are openly being imported, and we're using them every single day. And that is the focus of my talk today, is how, in this day and age, do we have corporations and governments that tolerate this type of human rights abuse at once. In fact, it becomes part of our economics as well. My topical area is corporate social responsibility. That's what we focus on in corporate social responsibility, is just that. The responsibility of corporations to be ethical and responsible to the communities at large as well. We're going to focus specifically on modern day slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, and child labor, and how it enters the supply chain and how each one of us gets impacted by it. And then obviously I'd like to focus at the end on what we can do about it, collectively and individually as well. How's that sound? Sounds like it ties into the human rights focus that you were hoping for. So as I also mentioned briefly, my background is both. I have both corporate experience and nonprofit experience. I work with Natalie when I was at Amnesty International, and I was on the board of Amnesty International USA. So I take the perspective both of a global human rights organization, but also having been in the trenches at a company managing some of these issues and some of these complexities from a business operations perspective. So when you think about business and you think about human rights, are there any stories or news articles, if you think back to the last 2 or 3 years, maybe a little more, that pop out of a human rights issue that impacted the business? Anything that comes to mind? Some kind of human rights violation that impacted the business?
The Rana Plaza fire in Bangladesh.
Excellent.
And Chinese sweatshops.
Okay. Can you say a little bit about the Rana Plaza?
I think it had textile manufacturing divisions in it with very unsafe work conditions, and then that led to a fire. And
it actually was collapsed, I believe.
it collapsed,
Yes.
or the
There was
fire
one
was
before that,
done.
the fire.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was a few years ago where there was a multi-story factory in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, that all of a sudden, quote unquote, collapsed, and over 1,000 people died. A few months before that, there was a fire in a factory where hundreds of people died. And in both cases, they realized that each building was not up to code, and there were plenty of warning signs that there's cracks in the building or the fire extinguishers aren't working, et cetera. So hundreds of people died in both these cases.
Weren't the workers also locked in from like the outside in one of them? as
They were
well?
coerced to go in, actually.
Pardon?
They were coerced to go in by management that threatened them that they will not get paid. It was the end of the month.
I don't think that's what I'm thinking of though.
So I think you're thinking about when the fire happened in Dhaka. There were bars on the windows and the emergency doors were locked.
Yes.
I think you're also referring to, there were, in the Rana Plaza, to collapse the building, there were a few workers who complained that they're seeing cracks and they're hearing cracks. But the management told them to go back in and keep working because they have to meet their quota within a month. Now, in the rubble of all this, after thousands of people have died, investigators were looking around and they found the clothing that was being manufactured, and the labels were tied to foreign brands, including Disney. Clothes sold at Walmart, Carrefour in France, and other places. So it wasn't just that this happened in Bangladesh. This impacted brands that we buy from every single day as well. So that was obviously a gross human rights violation on the part of everybody up and down that supply chain, and there's a lot of work being done right now to try to find a model that works to prevent this in the future. And we'll get into that a little later. Is there any other example that you could think of?
There was one in Pakistan. I don't know if it came in the international news, but it was 5 years ago, around 5 years ago. It was also a factory, a building.
Yeah.
There was fire and a lot of people died, and there was no
Yeah.
way to save them. People jumped and they were stuck.
Yeah.
Also, I believe the article was published in Guardian a couple of years ago on the Qatar situation, and Guardian followed up on it, but nothing has changed so far. Though ILO recently opened its office, but nothing has changed. And actually, I meant to ask a question about it.
My friend Mustafa, I don't know if you know Mustafa Kadri, works with the Amnesty International. He was working on the Qatar situation, like the Olympics and the human rights violations. Yeah.
We also have those kinds of negligences happening here as well. I think there was a scandal with the Hershey Corporation in Pennsylvania. They were using like immigrant child labor, and we also have young children working in our farms, cooking our food in America as well. They're tied to companies like Dole, our meat processing centers, Tyson. They employ illegal immigrants that they treat very grossly and underpay.
Okay. Yeah, those are all very sad, but very good examples of it. I'm glad you brought up that it also happens here in the U.S. To what you were saying earlier, it's not just standing industries in different parts of the world that implicate all of us. It's also sporting events. So the Qatar situation is that the World Cup, Soccer World Cup, Football World Cup in 2022, and there's been a lot of exploitation of South Asian workers that are being transported to Qatar to build the stadiums. And Amnesty did a report 5 years ago on it. Human Rights Watch has done reports on it. The Guardian has done tons of reports on it. Yet some things just don't seem to change, even though there's a lot of pressure around it as well. You brought up Tyson's and a few other places. I was just in Mexico this week where Driscoll's, the strawberry importer, there's lots of implications of them in Baja California, where strawberries are produced and being sold all the way up here in New Jersey and where I live in Washington, D.C. A lot of slave labor and child labor in those cases. I think 2 years ago, there was a case where these two unaccompanied minors were released from a detention center here in the U.S. to what ICE thought was their guardians, but they ended up enslaved in an egg farm in Ohio. And that was a large egg farm that supplied eggs all throughout the Midwest and the Eastern Seaboard. So there's tons and tons of examples of corporate irresponsibility. I'd also like to broaden it, not just into modern day slavery or human trafficking and labor rights. How many of you own a Volkswagen? I don't want to single you out. I was hoping more of you would say that. So now, what is Volkswagen really used for in the last 2 years?
Emission standards.
Say that again?
Emission standards. They're federal emission standards.
Yeah. You guys hear about this? So Volkswagen, I mean, they got levied one of the largest fines against corporate malfeasance in history. For a decade, they were producing diesel engines, telling people that they're safe, testing them, saying that they're lowering pollution. In fact, they lied. They installed software to alter the test results. And over a decade, and it turns out that how they got caught was they were saying they were producing these clean diesel engines, so pollution should be going down. Some researchers were like, you know what? They've been selling these cars for 10 years. Our pollution's getting worse. And it's the highest selling car in Europe. So they contacted some researchers in California, at the University of California, Berkeley. They did some tests and realized that they were lying. Do you know what has happened since they got caught? Any idea?
CEO dismissed themselves and they had to pay a lot of fines to the US mainly, not so much in Europe because it's a huge lobby in Europe and they have much power.
The CEO resigned and got $100+ million bonus as his severance package. There were 2, I think, executives that were held accountable. A couple of them are still in court. But after that massive scandal, where it was documented that this was a deliberate effort on Volkswagen's part that came from the executive office in Germany, he resigned with $100 million, and that's it. He's fine. He's good. And it was about a $10 billion settlement in the U.S., and there's some activity in Europe, but not much. So I'm shocked, I'm sure a lot of you might be as well, that this massive fraud can happen by a company. It can be documented, it can be taken to court, and nothing really happens. Like the guy who was in charge of it is now enjoying himself, probably some beach somewhere, with this $100 million. And what happened last year with Volkswagen after all this? They overtook Toyota to return to the #1 car producer in the world. So they clearly took no market hit for that. How many of you have an iPhone or a Mac? Remember 6 years ago, I think it was, 7 years ago, when ABC News for a whole week ran a special on this factory called Foxconn? Remember that?
Subsidiary of Apple, yeah.
So it was factories in China that produce iPhones and iPads. And they literally, the factories have, they call them suicide nets around the edges of the dormitories. Because the kids working there, and I say kids because they were younger, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids, they were so depressed working there, they were jumping out the building to commit suicide. So they had to install these suicide nets. And that was their solution to it. And ABC News ran specials every single week on this. This is 2 years ago. And like as an activist, you could not ask for better press about the situation. And I remember watching I think it was probably like the iPhone 7 or 6 Plus that got released that week. The same week that you had these gross images of kids committing suicide in factories, Apple's stock reached an all-time high. Investors did not care about it. Period. Did not care. It had zero impact on their market value. So that's kind of the environment. I think I've just depressed all of us thoroughly. That's kind of the environment that we're living in. We have standards, and we'll talk about some of the standards that we have around corporate conduct and business conduct. We also have lots of examples where corporations don't do something right or do something bad that results in serious injury to the person making it, but the rest of it's also the community. And there's very little means to hold them accountable to it. And obviously that has a massive human rights impact as well. In all of these cases, it's important to, I think, also see, well, how did they get in trouble for this? Was it their own, investigations they did internally, saying, hey, something's going on, something's wrong? Was it, shareholders that said, hey, we're hearing that we've got some child labor issues or emission standards issues? No, it was none of those things. In all of these cases, it's been media exposures, NGO, non-governmental organizations that do reports and investigate as well, or sometimes there is an employee that becomes a whistleblower, and I think part of the Volkswagen investigation also was a couple of whistleblowers came forward. It's very rarely a government that is doing an investigation and that finds out something and goes after a corporation. Now, you all pulled up the U.S. the list of goods made by forced and child labor. That list is produced every single year for the last 10 years. And I've had countless meetings in Washington, D.C. with folks up and down the chain at the Department of Labor saying, if you know, as taxpayers, we've spent millions of dollars on you sending researchers around the world and embassies around the world, U.S. embassies, to find out if, this bottle was made by a child. If you know that, you've documented that, then why is it still coming into the U.S.? Why is that company, in this case Dasani, which I think is owned by Coca-Cola, why are they still allowed to operate in the U.S. when we've documented that? And the answer also is like, well, that's a different department. That's for the State Department, that's for the Department of Defense, et cetera, to do that. Most recently, in the U.S., we have this thing called the tariff act, which there actually has been a law on the books for the last 50 years, I think, that says it is illegal to import any good that could be made by worse forms of child labor and forced labor. We've had that on the books. So the U.S. government has the authority under a congressional act to enforce its laws and to stop goods at the border that are suspected. Goods that our own government has investigated to be around that could be made by slave labor. Yet it doesn't enforce it. And for the last 3 years, there's been lots of nonprofit organizations advocating with Customs and Border Protection to enforce that act, but to very little effort, to very little of it. Partly because there just hasn't been that much political pressure on senators and our congressional representatives to hold our government institutions accountable, to say, hey, we have these laws, we have these values, you should hold them accountable. We just, was it 2 days ago, when we have a new NAFTA, we have a new free trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And despite what you think about the politics around it, a lot of advocates thought, oh, here's an opportunity, since we're opening up the agreement again, here's an opportunity to enforce some of the labor laws that we have in place. That was left out of the conversation, has been completely left out of the conversation. In fact, some of what I've been reading about this new agreement is it weakens some of the protections for workers as well. So we're heading in a different direction than one would hope. Any questions so far? Any other examples?
What about the time period where people were trying to use the Alien Torts Act to hold companies accountable in the U.S. for human rights abuses, and that kind of fell off and was told that that was appropriate?
Yeah, do you want to tell folks a bit more about the Alien Tort Act? Oh, whatever you know about it.
Was it the first time it was used for human rights abuses was to try a Paraguayan dictator who had taken refuge here, and then they started trying to use it against Coca-Cola and Sinatel Steel and Dole about sponsoring human rights abuses in other countries, saying if you're an American company or have American stakeholders, you should be tried with American legislation. And for a while it looked like it might work, but then they decided that if it didn't happen on American soil, they couldn't be held accountable.
That's exactly it. There's a law passed that gave jurisdiction to U.S. courts to hear from aliens, so non-U.S. citizens, if they were harmed by a company that has interests or material presence in the United States. I think it was in the 1920s, I think, that it was passed. I could be wrong on that. It was a while, about 100 years or so. Unfortunately, plaintiffs have tried to bring suit against a U.S. entity using the Alien Tort Statute, but it has gotten, the cases keep getting dismissed. Not sometimes based on materiality, like there just isn't enough evidence, or there just isn't enough presence. Like it could be a subsidiary of a U.S. company, it wasn't directly a U.S. company, but they always get, they tend to keep getting struck down and thrown out. The ones that have gone through have taken 8, 9, 10. I think the Nicaraguan example you were giving has taken about 12 years or so to get through. There's also the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed originally in 2000 and has been reauthorized every couple of years. That has also created some civil statutes, which is, civilly speaking, if I was harmed by a U.S. company, I could sue that U.S. company for those damages done. There's about 100 or so cases pending in civil. So a lot of folks are thinking that the civil action might be a more robust way to go, the more way to go.
Was that what the Monsanto case just came under?
The Monsanto case was under a European law, where the
I
Roundup.
thought it was an American man that brought the suit, at least an American farmer.
Yeah, but I think Monsanto got bought out by a company that's based in Germany, and so it was a European law that you saying that Roundup was causing birth defects or cancer. I think there was a question. Did you have a question?
I was going to go towards that one, so I have to tell you about it, because I've worked on it in the work statute. And there was a case about 15 years ago, associated with the Alvarez machine, and it's basically more or less shut the door on ATS claims, because the ATS, so it was the Alien Tort Statute, and basically if there was a tort committed against you, a violation of international law, you could bring it in the U.S., but that gives the U.S. basically universal jurisdiction. The Supreme Court decided that they didn't want universal jurisdiction, so they basically shut the door on most ATS claims. There's like a very, very tiny door, but most cases won't fit there.
Thank you. All right, so we've talked a lot about the bad things that companies do and what little we do to hold them accountable. Let's flip that. Let's talk about the positive. Let's talk about corporate social responsibility. So what do you think corporate social responsibility means? What is that? We kind of talking about it. So many hands go up all at once.
Corporations are better for society as a whole, but of course the counter to that is that they're often putting a Band-Aid on the messes that they themselves cause. So.
Keep just going back to the negative.
Well, you know, it's like BP, you know, they continue to pump oil, but then they want to do things like, oh, we're investing in solar, as if to make it better that they won't stop trying to open up Anwar, you know.
Yeah.
So.
Got a nice jaded audience.
Corporate social responsibility seems to mean different things to different companies. For some people, for some companies, it seems to mean foundation. For some people, it means diversity in hiring. For some, it means checking your supply chain to make sure that there's no violations along the way. So there's no one catch-all definition for CSR.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly it. And, you know, a lot of would say that it should be all those things, right?
Well,
Together. You should be hiring diversity. You should have a good supply chain. You should be engaged in the community. You should be paying your taxes.
I don't know why that comes under corporate social responsibility. It comes under other things as well.
Should be just corporate operations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. So I was a CSR director for a while, a few years ago. Things have changed quite a bit since then. And when I was a CSR director, it probably took 6 months before I talked to the operations folks, which is kind of weird. Here I am, corporate social responsibility director, and I've never talked to the folks in our company who are sourcing materials, who are planning business development, who are opening up factories or data centers or whatever that we had, which was kind of odd. And it was kind of a new field back then, so I didn't know any better. I didn't know that I should be talking to those folks on our operations side. My entire role, it was a great job for a while, because I would just travel the country and give presentations on corporate responsibility and maybe give out a little bit of money that, you know, we have some philanthropic money to give out. So it's a great job, and everyone wanted to talk to me because they thought I was giving out money, which I wasn't giving out that much money at all. But that was that was my role, you know, which was a lot of fun, but it was also very hollow, because all I was doing is we were ignoring any production side of the business. How do we source energy? Where do we get the paper from? How's that paper work? Where do we get How are our employees treated? How diverse is our workforce? Do women have a path to advance in the workforce, et cetera? None of that stuff. It was just about like, oh, here's a shelter that we're going to put some money at. Here's a legal justice system that we're going to throw some money at. So it was all that. And we got a lot of press out of it. And I remember I used to hang out with counterparts in other companies, large Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies. And they had the same role. It was very rare that they were with their supply chain folks or their operation folks. And it was also always very hard for them to partner with. There was always a tension there. I remember hanging out with folks at Disney and Nike and others, the CSR folks, and they were always trying to butt heads or with their supply chain folks. They, organizationally, even though had the same title, it could be a VP of CSR or a VP of operations or a VP of supply chain, the VP of operations and supply chain always had more internal power than the VP of CSR. So there's also that tension within the company of how seriously to take CSR versus how seriously to take your day-to-day sales and operations.
Yes, I want to share the concept of social responsibility in the country, for example. I consider this is a branding issue for enterprises.
Where are you
because
from?
In Peru.
Okay.
Because at the end, the biggest companies are trying to be friendly with the society, but they are using plastics, they are using chemicals, they are polluting the workers, and a lot of negative side effects. So I don't know if that's the word, if it's good, sounds very
Yeah. One second, I'm just going to ask. Peru is also an interesting example because there's a lot of gold mining in Peru that impacts a lot of indigenous populations. And it's quasi-state owned, from what I understand. There's lots of issues around deforestation and mining as well. To say then, like Turkmenistan and other areas that have state-controlled industries, the company's almost state-owned. And there's a front of we're responsible and the back not responsible at all. It's an interesting example where the state is actually the company that is not respecting people's rights. But doing the marketing to show that we are respecting people's rights.
So this is important because when you are in my country, there are the big discussions, debates about the issue. So the industries are asking, so what could we produce? Anything, because everything is polluted at the end.
From what I've seen in regards to CSR, it can be not problematic, but the temptation for companies and corporations to exploit the level of CSR that they've cultivated in the international community. If you look at Unilever, I think Unilever and Pfizer are two great examples of that. Unilever started the Project Sunlight program where they offered to, provide affordable water and cleaning products to developing countries. What's ended up happening is that Unilever products now have a monopoly in Africa, East Asia, and a lot of these developing countries, and they've beaten out local products. So, which is it's horrible because a lot of these products are marked up 30, 40, 50% above what they normally go for in market. With Pfizer, Pfizer had a program back in the 90s for a drug they had called Trovan, where they went to, I believe it was Kano in Nigeria, during the worst meningitis epidemic and offered to vaccinate as many people as they wanted. However, the consent sheets, it was a human trial. They'd already gone through animal testing and everything. The consent sheets, however, were printed in English, where no one could speak English. And the other drug, the other alternative was to have the traditional meningitis treatment. When they provided the drug, they gave 100 people the Trovan course of treatment. The other 100 people got the traditional meningitis treatment at half the strength, half prescription strength. So 100 people ended up dying, and the other 100 were disfigured, were affected, they were disfigured for life. they went to court and it ended up being thrown out because it was decided that this was it was a subsidiary of Pfizer, that they used a third-party company to administer the vaccine. So CSR, it can be, as I see it, a two-way street. From my personal, I don't know, how.
It's a two-way street in terms, a two-way street in terms of
how a company adheres to their commitment to the international community.
I think, so pharma is an interesting example.
Yeah.
Especially if you look at some of, like AIDS, and the AIDS epidemic. It wasn't out of the generosity of their hearts that pharma put out at a very low cost antiretroviral drugs in sub-Saharan Africa. It wasn't that at all. It was kicking and screaming that they were dragged to do it. After being caught of inflating prices aggressively, given what the production cost was. And now, and this is one of the great things that the Bush administration did, was we spend billions on anti-HIV drugs in sub-Saharan Africa, which is exactly what we should be doing. But it is us buying American pharmaceuticals to provide at a low cost or free to sub-Saharan Africans who have HIV. That is treating thousands of people and keeping them safe. But it's at a high cost to U.S. taxpayers, which is fine, because we should be helping each other out. When a lot of those drugs are actually made in Africa, or they're made in India at a much lower cost. So on the one hand, big pharma lobbies for the tax breaks, the R&D development, et cetera, markets how good they are, and there's always a number to call if you want cheap drugs, et cetera, if you can afford them. On the other hand, they're getting tax breaks, they're getting R&D money, and they're literally, the U.S. government is their customer to provide these drugs. So it's a complex web of, I wouldn't call it CSR at all. Like, that is actually some pretty smart business decisions on their end, right? They're getting the best of everything, right? But that's not CSR. CSR would be like, just, make the drugs, sell them for a little bit over cost, and let's be on our way, and everyone's healthy. Okay. That's what I would be CSR. I pay your taxes while you're at it. So it's a complex web. And I remember when Rana Plaza actually happened in the factory. I was in CSR, and I got to know the Disney CSR director pretty well. And I remember after Rana Plaza happened, we were always at the same meetings for like 6 months, same presentations and panels. And her job changed drastically from putting out really good things about Disney to complete defense. And you could tell that her general counsel had told her this is the talking point. And the talking point was, we don't produce our own products, we're licensing it. So if a factory in Bangladesh or a middle, or a import-export house, clothing house in India license our products, we have no control. So even though you're finding our labels in the rubble, it's not ours. We license it. And that is the question.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow up with what he was saying. The other day at the UN, the country Benin was talking about getting first-rate drugs because they don't want these cheap knockoffs being imported. Yeah. And they were actually the only country that discussed that, to my knowledge, because I watched these speeches that they gave, and they were talking about that. But diversity that I spoke about earlier, that's generally handled in the human resource department. So I don't know why certain companies do that as part of their CSR. Like you have Verizon, they give money to like educational, usually it's the feel good projects that employees like donate their time to, not these like clinical trials. I mean, I think that's a little bit more extreme. And not the big companies like Verizon, but the smaller companies who have the CSR. They pick a project, we're going to go rebuild, whatever, and, all the employees who want to come build homes for, whatever, they can do it on certain weekends and whatever it is. That's more of what I would think of as true CSR, not these horrible stories, because that's not corporate social responsibility. That's just disguising bad things.
Well, that's an interesting tension, right? And so when I joined my company, We were in the HR department
Mhm.
because under the previous CEO, and I got hired under the previous CEO, he realized that CSR is about operations and human resources. It's about making sure our employees want to be here, making sure that we'll be fair to all the employees, there's no discrimination, there's opportunity for everybody, no matter where you're from, et cetera. Within about 6 months of the new CEO coming in, we got moved to the marketing department. So my role changed from a lot of internal work to going around the country doing our money. But that was a strategic focus of saying, okay, our CSR is in marketing, it's just to make the company look good, regardless of what we're actually doing. I think that was a mistake. I think that is a mistake. I think that a good CSR department would be at the executive level, so report, like, the SVP should be reporting to the CEO, and should be in constant communication with the head of operations, the head of sales, the head of business development, the head of sourcing, et cetera, et cetera. Like, that should be what CSR is. And if you look at a company and you're trying to evaluate their CSR work, just look at where it's at. And look at how high level the head of that department is. Are they an SVP, are they a VP, are they a managing director, are they just a manager, et cetera, et cetera. That's what's going to tell you. I want to talk a little bit about some of the levers that we have, excuse me, to compel companies to act responsibly and define CSR as a responsible business operations, period. We talked a little bit about the Alien Tort Statute, which your research shows that it's not very effective, hasn't been used that much at all. What are some other things that you can think of that compel companies to be good, socially conscious operators?
Boycotting them, unfortunately. I feel like they don't listen to protesters, they listen to your dollar.
Yeah. What do people think about boycotts?
Usually effective.
But they were certainly effective, like around apartheid and others. And I remember we used to do a lot more boycotts in the 70s and 80s and 90s around Nike and child labor in Indonesia. A lot of people now say, a lot of advocates are against boycotts. Can you imagine why? Like, can you guess why?
I would guess that in realities of global economy, any boycott, in contrast to what would happen like 50 years ago locally, would hurt the business entities on either end of the supply chain, like those workers in Bangladesh, for example. They will not be happy. And by the way, to my knowledge, nothing has changed after these events that were covered so well by the media. And so I think responsibilities should be met with both ends of the supply chain.
Yeah. What do people think about that? A boycott also does hurt the people that are making the shirts and the shoes and the goods on the other end. So a lot of advocates have been kind of anti-boycott in the last many years. Because the reality is such that people still need to work. And we do have a few more levers now to make the change as opposed to a full-on consumer boycott. A few years ago, I think it was about 7 years ago, the UN commissioned a professor from Harvard named John Ruggie to come up with a framework around business and human rights. And so he and his team did a lot of research for a couple of years, involved a lot of hundreds of corporations around the world. And they came up with a business and human rights framework called Principles Around Business and Human Rights, and named John Ruggie. And they're a set of voluntary principles that lay out what we expect as a global community from business conduct. And that's about good operations, sourcing appropriately, due diligence, which means proactively looking into how your suppliers are treating their workers and having some standards around that, how they're treating the environment. And then thirdly, and most importantly, is access to remedy. So if you are a person anywhere in the world who's been harmed by a business, it could be that you work at a factory and there weren't good safety measures and you got injured, or the factory is releasing pollutants into your drinking source, and so you're contracting a disease because the water is polluted. If you have any of those issues, you should have a means to access remedy from that company directly. It's a beautiful guide. It's a beautiful resource, and a lot of companies to this day are saying, we follow the human rights principles set out by John Ruggie. Sounds great on paper, doesn't it? Since it was adopted unanimously by the United Nations, with this input from businesses, we've been trying to get more and more companies to align with it truly. You mentioned last week in New York, the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations also comes out with the SDGs, the development goals every year. This past round, so a year and a half ago or so, a lot of businesses have input in these development goals that we all set, which is kind of a global framework and benchmark of how we want to reach development targets like lack of pollution, economic prosperity, anti-poverty, women's empowerment, et cetera. And some of those, like I think 8.7, the SDG 8.7 is around child labor, and there are a bunch of others around certain economic and social indicators. So a lot of companies try to put on their CSR goals in the buckets of that development framework. Now, notice that all of these two things that I've mentioned, none of them is a law, right? They're all voluntary principles that we have. That means we just expect, because the political climate that we're in, we expect that we're going to, all of us together, it takes years, come up with these development frameworks, come up with these expectations, but we expect companies to voluntarily take them up and then tell us about it. But there's no legal measure to hold them accountable to it. The theory of change has been that once the public finds out that a company has not met those goals, then they won't buy from them, they might do their own personal boycott, or they'll tweet at them, or they'll write them, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, around the human rights and human trafficking space, in the last 7 years, 8 years, we have seen different states and different countries pass these laws that are around disclosure. So back in late 2005, 2008 maybe, when California passed a supply chain transparency that it was the end of around close to 2010, somewhere between 2010, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor. He signed it, and all it said is that if you're a business over a certain threshold in California, sourcing in these industries, retail and food and beverage, I think, you have to let the public know what you're doing to eliminate human trafficking and human rights violations from your supply chain. And it took years to get this bill passed. Lots of business opposition to it. To be in compliance with the law, you could put on your website that we don't do anything about human rights violations or human trafficking, and you would be in compliance with the law. Because all it says is let the public know what, if anything, you're doing about this issue in your supply chain. Since then, Sweden, France, Australia, the UK, Norway, I think Belgium's thinking about it. Other countries have taken this law and passed it in their own jurisdictions. And it's taken a lot of energy and a lot of work to make it happen. But think about it. It still isn't a legal mechanism that says if a company did X that was wrong, then they should pay Y, or they should fire X, Y, Z, etc. So it still is just disclosure, saying that we're leaving it to the companies to tell us what to do. And the philosophy is that the consuming public and shareholders will hold that company accountable for that conduct. That is really, aside from a few of the civil suits that we see now and then that take years and lots of money, that is really the only mechanism we have as the public to, I can't even say accountable, but to make sure that companies are doing the right thing and being responsible in their communities and environments, et cetera, et cetera. Does that sound like it's a little flawed?
But doesn't this all go to what we learned in the global governance that took it with Neil Ferguson of establishing norms, and then you start getting these actions, like in the rugby framework that you were talking about. Once you start establishing these norms, they become standard operating procedure, for lack of a better term, so that when you deviate from that,
Yeah.
there's a problem.
They do. The problem is that norms, as opposed to laws, are subject to the whim of the executive in charge. So if you have a company that has a progressive CEO who is probably private because they're not accountable to revenue to shareholders every quarter, he or she probably has more leeway, if they're progressive minded, to say, hey, you know what, I want to make sure that we are completely in compliance with these disclosure laws, we are following the rugby principles, we are meeting our goals towards the SDGs, et cetera. And I want to report every quarter, not just on the numbers of sales, but I also want to report on how we're getting close to these sustainable development goals. That's the problem, is because if it's not institutionalized, it's going to be at the whim of the executives in charge at that point. They may become normative practices, but if nothing's holding them accountable, and the only pressure you have is from shareholders saying you have revenue targets, then that's not going to become institutionalized. And that's what we see in CSR. One second, just one point to that.
But they were talking about it at the General Assembly, because I watched these from last week, and they were all talking about norms and the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs and all of this, and a lot of them were talking about labor and all of this, so that whole idea kind of runs through.
Yeah, it's a lot of good talk.
Yeah, oh no,
It's a lot of good talk.
to listen to them was very
it's
interesting
amazing, yeah.
on what, the reforms that they've been trying to get through in the UN for the past 4 years.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting, actually.
It is, and so so I haven't personally been on, like I've been to lots of conferences in the last, who definitely know their stuff. And from when I was CSR director to now, many years later, there is a lot more rhetoric around the issue and a lot more seeming internalization of those issues. Yet ask any one of those companies to say, okay, that's great. You say you've normalized it, you've built a team around it, and I believe you, you actually have. Disney's done some great things since then, Nike's done some great things since their issues with child labor. Would you get behind a law that says if we find you violating any of these principles, we can hold you civilly liable? Let's see what they say. They won't do it. Right? And it's a classic like, well, if you have nothing to fear, then support it. Right? It's a classic that. So the rhetoric is great, and a lot of activists now, especially after UNDA, I saw a lot of blogs from different human rights organizations that said the speeches were amazing. Like these executives get it, they know it, they feel it, they breathe it, but now we want to see implementation. We've been talking about this. People have signed on to these principles, but we're not seeing that much change on the ground as we should, given how much rhetoric we have and how many global agreements there are. And that's what's going to make the difference is 4 years from now, if we see that there was a reduction in poverty, if we see that there's less exploitation of women in the garment industry, if we see that, which we haven't yet, to the scale that we're talking about, then maybe we'll say, okay, these normative principles, voluntary principles are working. As opposed to, no, we actually need to teach them. You can sue them and take them to court. There were a couple of other hands up there.
Yeah. So the issue of child labor, when you talked about values, the value systems here in the Western world and developed world is very different than the value systems in poor countries where these child labor are utilized. And for some of these children, it's a source of living, a source of income that would help feed them or their family members. Some of them are very, very happy to go to work, not just them, but their family. And I understand how controversial the issue is, and I understand how wrong that is. There is if we could create a world where no child had to work, and nobody had to work ever, that would be great. But the problem is that sometimes the imposition of the value systems we have here do not apply as well there as we would want them to. So the question, let's say if you work very strongly and you're able to push on a particular factory, and the factory is shut down, the factory hires around 2,000 children, and those children, they don't go to school because they're going to work, and they use that money and income to survive and feed themselves and their family. Now that chain is cut off. Does that mean there should be more work done on how to help families support themselves and their children so that they don't have to be pushing their children to go to work instead of school in the first place, rather than working on the other side, the other way around? Should there be more push, more like a from the bottom up rather than a top-down policy system on this issue? How much have you worked on that?
Yeah, what do people think about this? It's an interesting question. Let's see if someone hasn't spoken. Anyone hasn't spoken yet? Want to address that?
going to say I've heard two things about that issue. One of them is there's a human rights organization that breaks up like prostitution rings, and they did a documentary on one of them. I can't remember the name, but it was in South Africa or South America somewhere. And they arrested all the like pimps and the people who were shopping. And they told the women like you're free to go. And the women right back on the street because they said this is how we have no education, we have no other way to support our families, this is how we have to live. So just reminding me of that. And Warren Buffett, like the wealthiest man in America, or second wealthiest behind Bezos, or whatever it is now. His brother is a farmer and also is a billionaire, whatever. And goes to countries like Colombia, places like that, and actually helps them come up with farming techniques that can increase their production and that they're also able to do, because he said, like, let's say Bill Gates will send a bunch of John Deere equipment, okay, but they either don't know how to use that equipment, or like once it runs out of gas or something, they have no way of, that's not very sustainable. So Warren Buffett's brother actually goes and creates a sustainable plan with these communities in order to help them get out of situations like the nursing.
Can I just respond from a corporate perspective?
Sure.
In my opinion, if the corporations paid a living wage, then maybe like you wouldn't have to have 10 people in the family working to earn what one person could actually earn. That's my solution from a corporate perspective. Why are we paying people 60 cents to make a Nike shoe that we sell for $150? Like the corporations could pay the people more.
Just to kind of address directly, like when you were talking, I was thinking about the soccer balls, and then you have the tension between like UNICEF and the ILO. UNICEF was encouraging child labor because sometimes the children were the only ones in the family working, whereas the ILO, since its inception, has been trying to get rid of child labor. And they're going to turn 100 next year, and they still haven't gotten rid of it. So then you have that tension, too, going on. So I understand what he's talking about, because when you have one UN agency saying, go ahead, and the other one's trying to get rid of it, are you ever going to get rid of it? And you can't. And I understand it's basic survival, but be consistent in your message from the UN, please. Thank you.
Yeah, UN chunky over here.
I want to share the case of Bolivia, where the constitutionally is allowed to children to get a job, because there is a different conception about what's jobs in terms of culturally. The kids should learn to get a job, it's like a preparation. So culturally, it's accepted to inside the family, child to collaborate or get a job to support their familiar incomes. So I think this is a different case than supply chain job or survival incomes.
Yeah. Did you have your hand up as well? Somebody else have their hand up?
Yeah, I think it's parallel to the questionable voting position of the Western values onto the developing countries. And I thought that also the American, we see in American history that the United States labor also experienced the same stages. You know, we were battling here child labor and unfair wages and working conditions. And I believe it is necessary for emergence of the healthy civil society to let I mean, it's a work that must be done, as we say, at the lower end of the chain, of the supply chain. We cannot infuse those regulations and values. They must emerge within.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. What country were you thinking about?
I've lived in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and all of these countries have child labor. And I must say that I had neighbors who, and my friends, that the kids that I grew up with, like when I was 14, 15 years old, and they were doing this for a living. There are families, as you know, in our part of the world with 5 and 6 kids. And while they were doing this, and because I did not have my friends to play with, so I would go and work with them. This was making carpets, and I learned how to make carpets because I had my kid friends like around 14, 15 years old who were making carpets at that time.
Were you also going to school?
Huh?
Were you also going to school?
I went to school. They went to school too.
Okay.
We all did go to school, but I know that there are kids who would not go to school. Their parents wanted them to go to school, and after school they would come and work.
Yeah.
We all did go to school, but the point is that if those 5 kids did not work on making carpets is a very hard task. It requires a lot of patience. And generally, if you're an older person, let's say about 30 or 40 years old, it's very hard to be that patient to be able to focus and do that work. Generally, if you're around like 14, 15 years old or 18 and 20, and someone pushes you, then you're much better at it. So I mean, I must say, I'm not trying to make a case for it's important. I mean, I see the horrible side of it. As I said, I personally got affected because the time that I should have spent with my friends, we had to go and work on carpets with them because I just wanted to be around those friends. But having said that, I think it's important to keep in mind that sometimes we are doing a top-bottom system on issues and trying to impose these value systems here that do not very much apply. And I know that you're very familiar with these arguments. I know that you have debated this very well, probably in every other conference that you attended. But nonetheless, I wanted to ask, because I do not understand what is the justification that, and how is it, if you are pushing for what you're pushing, how are you trying to take care of the other side of the issue?
So thanks for bringing this up. Thanks for all your responses. I'm from India. I became a U.S. citizen about 3 years ago. And I'm going to push back on the notion that it's not having child labor is a Western value. It's been illegal. Child labor has been illegal in India for a long time. Most countries in the world have signed on to ILO conventions that outlaw child labor. We have a very progressive constitution that was passed in 1950 in India that is very good about equality for everyone, especially children. Kailash Satyarthi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago, is from India, founded this great anti-child labor organization in India that's in India. So his work is rooted in Indian values that children should have all the opportunities that they should have through education, prosperity, etc. Most labor laws, including in the U.S., will say that children of certain ages are allowed to work for whatever reason. In your case, it looked like you wanted to be with your friends, or usually because of economic necessity, as long as they're also going to school. We have that here in the U.S. as well, where a lot of farming communities, children will work in the summer, after school, during harvest, etc., as long as they're also going to school. What we have in a lot of places in India and Southeast Asia, and sometimes here in the U.S., is children will work at the expense of going to school. I've been to areas outside of Delhi in India where I have seen children wake up every morning in the slum, walk past the school to go to the factory and work in the factory all day. And I've seen the factory owners give money to the police force, who should be enforcing the laws, allowing this to happen as well. The whole system is set up because there is no enforcement of the law and the value. So as long as children of a certain age, not working in certain industries that are hazardous, are also going to school, there is an allowance in just about every law, including the ILO guidance on these issues, of when it's acceptable for children to work. Because of the economic necessity of the parents, the family needs a living wage. Last year, one of my clients was a company called Geopol, and we did surveys. We used mobile phones to do surveys of workers around the world about their issues. And we did a survey in Tanzania, looking at this gem called tanzanite. It only comes from this 2-kilometer radius, in Tanzania, sold at Macy's and JCPenney's and other places here in the U.S. And the supply chain is, it only gets dug in this area in Tanzania, it goes to India to get polished, and it comes to the U.S. and Europe, etc. And we asked the 400 or 500 folks that we surveyed over SMS about child labor. I think about 15 to 20% or so said yes, there were children working in the mines. We did the exact same survey in the DRC. looking at lithium and cobalt and other things that go into electronics. Same thing, about 15 to 20% of people that we surveyed said that there were children working in the mines. We asked them, well, what can we do about that? Like, what do you think is the solution to this? Every one of them said, pay the parents a living wage. Just pay us more so that we can send our kids to school, and also build a school and a hospital near the mines so that they can go to school, we'll go to work, pick them up after school, and after work we come back home. So it's not a Western value that's being imposed upon the rest of the world. The rest of the world has agreed to ILO norms that say we want to abolish child labor. Most of the world has very progressive labor laws that allow for some exceptions. There are lots and lots and lots of NGOs that are approaching the issue, including in the carpet weaving industry in Nepal and Afghanistan, that recognize economic necessities. So they try to help build skills for parents so they can get higher paying jobs. They try to work with the carpet retailers and other retailers to increase wages on the supply chain. They try to build amenities like schools, etc., within walking distance of the villages where the communities of children go to schools. They try to build hospitals and health centers so that there's less pressure economically for those families so they can get their issues taken care of, etc. So it's a very holistic approach that activists and NGOs and governments are taking to eliminate child labor. But it's all based on the shared value that poverty there's an economic necessity for some children to work, but that should not be at the expense whenever possible of them lacking the future as well.
So, Sarwar said they are like quite happy with children who work. So I'm from Pakistan.
I'm sorry, I was referring to the families. I mean, the families who are sending the kids, not the children themselves. They want to play. They're not happy playing.
But anyways, in my experience,
I mean, the families who are sending the children because that's how they would feed themselves. So.
Okay. In Karachi, I remember talking to these kids who used to collect garbage and then sell it. I mean, they were quite miserable. So one issue is that in countries like Pakistan, the government spends 2.6% of its GDP on education, which is the lowest in the world. I think the expected years of education is 8.1, which is the lowest in South Asia. Right? And then these kids have abusive parents. I remember this one kid talking about how his father doesn't go to work. He beats them and he beats his mom, and that's why he has to do this. And I think the other thing is the abuse at workplace where they go, right? And the exploitation. So I think, and I remember, I mean, I never went to work, but I was born and raised in a very difficult position, like in a small village and growing up. So I can imagine kids not being able to go to school but have to work, and going through that process. It's quite difficult. And in India there is this, I'm sure, I don't know if you know the Shanti Bhavan. They work in, I think, South India. I got to speak to the guy, Ajay, the son of the founder, and I have yet to write the story. I mean, they are working on this generational poverty, like kids in slums, and just breaking that is so difficult that you know they have not been able to get to school for decades.
And I think, you know, you look at, I'm trying to cut you off. Sorry.
No, I think what you said, the values, the right of getting education is, I think, it should be everyone's right, regardless of culture.
Yeah, and it's also very personal. When I go back to India, my mom still lives there, so I go all the time. You see child labor everywhere. You see it during the day when kids should be in school. Like, you see it everywhere. And you also see the economic necessity because they're also living on the side of the street. Like it's a very difficult circumstance. But you also, if you go around, and I'm just speaking personally, in middle class India, there's also a reliance on cheap labor. You know, the same thing happens with there's various countries in the world where you will have this class of, we call them servants, and many of them could be underage, that you pay very little to, either directly or through an agency. And you're just reliant on that cheap labor. And in India, at least, as the middle class incomes have rise significantly since the 1990s, since we opened up the economy, et cetera. Wages for the working class and the servant class have not increased as much, given the rise in middle class income. So because it's a reliance on cheap labor, because you want to have someone to drive your car, cook your clothes, cook your food, clean your clothes, et cetera, for cheap, so you can afford it. The same thing here. We want to go to H&M, we want to go to Target, we want to go to Banana Republic and be able to buy a $12 t-shirt. If you think about it, it's a t-shirt for $12. Like, in what universe does that supply chain make sense, and how much is that person making at the end of it when you think about all the different costs that a company incurs plus their profit margin? Like, I want to buy a $12 t-shirt, therefore I'm going to ignore a lot of the stuff I hear about how that t-shirt was made, let alone the workers who produce it, but also the chemicals how that cotton was sourced, how the chemicals were put in to dye the t-shirt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's also a very conscious thing that we participate in because we rely upon cheap sources of labor and good, et cetera, for our own middle class existence. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out, and you might disagree with me, that at least in India, I don't think viewing it just as a matter of economic necessity is a bit misleading, because India is also a society which is deeply divided. So there's a certain culture of, there's a feudal culture, there's a patriarchal culture which expects certain sections of the population to be servile towards you. And it's also, the values that protect kids in India, which Kailash Satyarthi exposes, are just the other side of the coin, which also perpetuates the system of much like how slavery was in the US and how black people face discrimination. Here, in structural biases.
You're absolutely right.
So how can one counter that in human rights narrative?
When you figure that out, you'll be the next Kailash Satyarthi, right?
Oh no, I don't want such a heavy mantle.
but you're absolutely right, and it's if you think about apparel, the apparel industry, which is massive in South Asia, Southeast Asia, increasingly in Sub-Saharan Africa. Very, very low-paying jobs traditionally. I think like 85 to 95% of the workers are women in those low-paying jobs. That has a lot to do with economic necessity. It has a lot to do with sexism and misogyny. Gandhi, his big thing was untouchables, other castes. Hindus and Indians have to figure out the caste system before we can achieve the aims of our Constitution. These are all grounded in very much personal identity issues as well, and our ability to say, well, that person who looks like that, or is a certain gender or caste, et cetera, they want that job. They're going to be happy in that job. I wouldn't do it myself. And we say the same thing here. That's why, regardless of the rhetoric around immigration, the Trump winery was one of the, in Virginia, is one of the leading, was one of the, they applied for the most amount of temporary visas for migrant workers here in Virginia, right? Because it's migrant workers they want to come pick their grapes, not Americans, for those wages that they're paying. Right? We always have some other class that we put in the position, that keep in that position, to do the work for us, that we will not pay a fair wage for. And we will create institutions around it to do it. Which kind of takes us into a different direction than that is. So thank you for bringing up those points. Since we only have a few minutes left, I'd like to end on something more positive. And that is more of, we talked a lot about norms that we can or cannot expect companies to follow, even though there are lots of global guidelines and a little bit of regulations around it. We talked a little bit about how much we expect companies to follow those and what following those global norms look like and doesn't look like. We also talked about the failure of the legal system in most parts of the world and globally to hold companies accountable to conduct and this to good conduct. And that could be all the way from, a local labor inspector outside of Delhi to hold a factory accountable for the child labor or illegal migrant workers they have in there, not illegal, but undocumented migrant workers are being mistreated in their factories. To, are there any about how, despite massive fraud that Volkswagen perpetrated on all of us. The executive got away scot-free, even though the company did pay a lot of fines, but they regained their market share, et cetera, as well. So I want to kind of end on like what you think some things that you can personally do to make sure that the companies that you buy from, places you go to every day, whether buy clothes or eat a salad, et cetera, how you can hold them accountable. Like, what are some of the things that you can do? I'm looking at you there.
Yeah.
I can
I
look
just
at
keep
you.
thinking of supply chain, but I don't know how I would get access to, yeah. With a public company, you would have better, more information. I still think that there are many ways that they could hide.
I think the first thing is to know about these things, right? If you don't know, you're not even thinking about it. So if you go to a store, what you're looking for is the cheapest shirt or shoes, right? I mean, up until this morning, I knew some of the things, but we're always looking for cheap stuff, right? So I think the first thing is to disseminate information, to talk to friends and family and members and whoever you talk to about these issues, and that's how.
Yeah, but I think his question is bigger than that. His question is like, when you already know that, like, what do you do to actually try to change the behavior of the company?
But that's a great first step.
Which is a really bigger, much bigger question. I mean, they make apps, you can like scan things at stores, whatever. You also have to be very vigilant. Companies get bought out all the time. You know what I mean? Ben & Jerry's, maybe they still don't use milk that has RBST, but they are owned by Kellogg, which is owned by who knows what. So Tom's of Maine got bought out by Colgate. Burt's Bees got bought out. I mean, it's like, so even when you have faith in a company, they typically get bought out somewhere down the line by a corporation.
Yeah.
So like, what do you do in that situation?
Has anyone ever contacted like customer service in the company for anything?
Yeah.
Yeah, they respond?
Yes.
Do they respond?
Mm-hmm. Some do.
Yeah. Did you have a hand up back there?
No, sorry.
So I remember a few years ago, it was like 3 years ago, probably, 2 years ago. So there was a lot of press that came out about slavery in the seafood industry. You guys remember seeing headlines about this? Coming from Thailand and Laos and Cambodia. There's a ton of it. Like it's just, I think Pulitzers have been won based on stories of slavery in the seafood industry. And I remember, so we have a pet dog, and she eats this brand of pet food called Wellness. That's some smaller family-owned company, it's a private company. And I saw that one of their ingredients was fish meal, was mentioned in some of these articles. So I called up Wellness right away, and they answered right away. And I was like, just saw this article, what's going on? And the customer service people, she put me on hold for like 2 seconds, and someone else got in the line. And they they were prepared to take these calls. They told me exactly what they were doing. They pointed me in the direction of like what are on their website, they tell about what they're doing. And then they sent me coupons in the mail a few weeks later. But I was like really like, wow, so they actually they're kind of taking it seriously because there was enough press about this. They probably got a few dozen calls that day, probably a couple hundred that week. And they did respond. And I remember when I was also sales director at this company, and I had certain accounts, so my team was managing certain accounts. And at the end of the day, I would get a summary of customer feedback. Every day I'd get a summary of customer feedback about the products. And if there were any issues for key customers, I'd have to get on like with my boss the next day and try to take care of those issues. Like that's how much we cared about customer feedback. So I say all that because if we start going to XYZ companies saying, hey, you know what? I want the $15 t-shirt, but I'm a little worried about, where it's made, how it's made. And it's important to me as your customer, can you prioritize that? Or can you tell me what you're doing? That's going to build up. That is going to build up. And that's going to make its way up the chain to the people that are making decisions about it. Now, when I was working with companies more closely, I remember, we have a coalition of companies working on these issues. We'd go around the room with different executives saying, why are you here? Why are you at this table talking about supply chain issues? Each one of them This was a couple years ago. Each one of them had a personal story that was like, well, I was in Cambodia and I saw our factory and this happened. And my kid is in high school and she did a report on human trafficking, so I got educated. And that's why I'm here. None of them, very few of them said, well, I'm here because our shareholders are on our butts. And what are you guys doing about slave labor in Bangladesh? Or we're getting 100 customer calls a day saying, the seafood supply chain is. But if there were shareholders and consumers holding them accountable, they would act. Lastly, I remember many, many years ago, I did a lot of work in Chicago, a lot of grassroots work around sex trafficking and labor issues, and labor abuses. And I remember we were in a certain area in Chicago where there was a lot of sex trafficking happening. And we were working very closely with the local police department. And I remember talking to the commander of the district. And I was like, hey, as an NGO, we've documented all these issues, crime rates up, you're having a lot of sex trafficking arrests, and you're arresting victims and all that. What's going on here? And she was like, Samir, I'll be honest with you. When I get, I'm focusing very little attention on this because I get calls every day about a drug dealer on the corner, the potholes, pickpockets. I never get calls about sex trafficking. If I start getting calls about sex trafficking, sure, I'll start applying the law that we already have against sex trafficking and go after the Pins and the Johns, et cetera, et cetera. But I won't until I start getting calls from people. Because, why would I? That's clearly not what the community wants me to be working. And so I've stuck to, I think about that all the time, because on one hand, if you start telling companies, we start telling companies, hey, we expect more from you. We expect you to be genuinely responsible. And there is enough. There are enough apps, there are enough websites out there to tell you what companies doing what. And if, on the other hand, we also put pressure on our elected officials, even locally, that, hey, we have laws on the book that prohibit child labor. We have laws on the book that prohibit the importation of slave-made goods. What's going on? Why aren't you bringing that up on the floor of the House or the Senate? Why aren't you bringing that up in the state law, et cetera? They will act. The more they hear from us, they will act. One thing I did notice that, we're in elections, so we're all being barraged by election advertising. I've noticed that some congressional candidates on both sides of the aisle have brought up their work on labor trafficking and human trafficking issues in their campaign ads, which is a positive sign that more and more people are interested in the issues and more people are supporting candidates who take leadership in these issues as well. So there is, while I may have painted a very negative picture about what is happening in terms of corporate social responsibility, I do think there's still a lot that we can do within that to make sure that both companies are accountable to the values we have and governments hold those companies accountable to the laws that we have and the values that we have. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.